I'm Dickson, and today we're going to be talking about a series of lures called the Spoonplug, which I consider to be by far the greatest lure that's ever been made. Now, I realize it's a little unusual to make an entire video on just one particular lure, but in about 90% of all of my fishing, I'm using a Spoonplug, and I consider these lures to be critical to my overall success. So today I want to first explain why I use Spoonplugs, and then I want to take you out here on this lake and show you exactly how to use these lures, both casting and trolling. But before we do all that, I'd like to steal a clip from a recent television show and review some of the basic facts concerning the habits of a game fish so that we'll have a better understanding of what it is that we're trying to control once we actually go out there on the water. Now, once this has been accomplished, I'll demonstrate how to properly fish the Spoonplug and explain in detail why I consider it to be the ultimate lure. I think it's important to understand what it is we're trying to control once we get on the water. Now, when we're talking about controls, most fishermen today think in terms of size, color, and action. And this is how they go about choosing their lures. But I maintain that the only true controls we have in fishing are the controls of depth and speed. Now, let me explain what I mean. It was about 50 years ago that a physics professor from North Carolina by the name of Buck Perry made some revolutionary discoveries about the habits of a game fish. And one of the most startling discoveries was that the really big fish spend most of their time in deep water. He also discovered that the fish move about in the lake from both a daily and a seasonal standpoint, and when they make these movements or migrations, they will follow features on the bottom of the lake that he referred to as structure. He then discovered that how far these fish would move and how long they would stay would be completely dependent upon the weather and the water conditions. Now, these conditions are changing not only day to day, but hour to hour, and even sometimes minute to minute. So no two fishing days are alike. One day we may find the fish in 15 feet of water, and then the next day we may find them in 22 feet of water. The next day we may have to go to 35 feet to find a fish, and next week we may have to go to 45, 50, or even 60 feet of water. Now, in order to catch a fish, we must put our lure where he is. So it only makes sense that depth control is the #1 control we have in fishing. Next, we need to consider speed control. Now, when I'm talking about speed control, I'm not talking about how fast a lure might wiggle, but I'm talking about how fast a lure moves from point A to point B. And the reason this is so important is that fish are cold-blooded creatures, and their metabolism changes with the temperature of their environment. In the colder season, their metabolism is very slow, and the fish become quite dormant. Therefore, during the colder season, our speed control should be slow. And then in the summer months, as the water begins to warm, their metabolism increases and our speed control would be fast. In fact, Buck Perry proved years ago that if you bring a lure past a fish where he is, depth control, and you move it by him at the right speed as per his metabolism, he has no choice in the matter but to strike that bait 100% of the time. Now, once you accept the fact that all fishing failures and all fishing success should be answered in terms of depth and speed, you might then ask the question, what lures do I use to control all of these different depths and all of the different speeds in my lake? Now, there's always been a lot of confusion about how to choose the right lure, mainly because there are literally thousands of lures out there to choose from. But when you begin to analyze it, you'll discover that every lure that was ever built falls into one of 4 different categories. In reality, there are only 4 different types of lures. We have the topwater lures, we have weedless lures, then we have the jump type baits such as jigs and plastic worms, and then we have the 4th category, which is the free-swimming bottom bumping lures, which are commonly referred to as crankbaits. Now, all of these different types of lures will catch fish some of the time, and they all have a place in successful fishing, but clearly some are better than others. Now, keeping in mind the basic movements of the fish and the importance of depth and speed control, let's take a look at all of these different types of lures. First, we have the topwater baits. Now, these lures can be worked very slow or very fast, and they're not limited as to speed control. But quite obviously, they've been designed to work on the surface and are very limited when we're thinking in terms of depth control. Then we have the weedless lures. Again, these particular baits can be fished slow or fast, but they were designed to work in the more shallow, weedier areas and are limited as to depth control. Now, the next category of baits is referred to as the jump type lures. Now, these are the jigs, the plastic worms, the jigging spoons, the blade baits, or any weighted lure. Now, since these lures sink, they can literally be fished at all of the different depths. However, these lures are limited as to speed control, because once we begin to impart too much speed to these lures, they will begin to leave the bottom. And once that happens, we lose our number one control of depth. So these lures can only be fished slow. And then next we have the free-swimming bottom-bumping lures, or the crankbaits. And this category of lures is by far the most important group we have, because they can be fished at many different depths and at all of the different speeds. You know, years ago, Buck found out by fishing all over the United States and Canada that in order to consistently catch big fish, he had to control all of his depths and all of his speeds from 0 to a depth of 60 feet. And most of the crankbaits that were being built back then would only dive down to 8 or 10 feet. Some maybe even as deep as 15, but this just wasn't good enough. So Buck designed a series of lures that would allow him to fish all of these depths regardless of speed, both casting and trolling from the bank to a depth of 60 feet. And he called these lures Spoonplugs. These lures are made out of brass and can be cast into the deepest water and allowed to sink to the bottom. Once you begin your retrieve, the design of the lure will keep it on the bottom all the way back to the boat. The Spoonplugs were also designed for trolling. Each lure has a minimum and maximum depth range that can be achieved by simply changing your line lengths. Once you reach 25 feet with the largest size Spoonplug, you can simply change to a solid steel Manel wire line and more than double the depth of each lure. So with just one series of lures and two types of line, you can effectively fish from the bank to a depth of 60 feet, whether casting or trolling. Now, in our earlier shows, I mentioned that our guide to finding where the fish will be is structure. Now, there are many different types of structures, such as bars, humps, underwater reefs, underwater road beds, the causeways, underwater railroad grades and saddles. But the most common structure we have is a bar. Now, when fish move along these structures, it's important to understand that even though they see very well, they can't see very far. And many structures are so large that they need some additional features to guide them on their way. And these features are referred to as breaks and break lines. Now, the breaks are objects on the bottom of the lake, such as stumps, weed beds, or rock piles, and things of this nature. And then a break line is where we have a line on structure where we have a sudden increase in depth. And this is sometimes referred to as a drop-off. Now, the importance of these features is that when fish move on structure, they will eventually pause and stop at a break or a break line on or connected to that structure. And these are the spots where you and I will meet up with the fish. Now, quite obviously, these spots are going to be occurring at many different depths. No two structures are alike. The structure in your lake may be completely different than the one in mine, and the one in my lake will probably be completely different than the one in someone else's lake. So in order to catch fish on a consistent basis, we must have the lures that will enable us to fish all of these spots. Now, regardless of the lake type I'm fishing or the species of fish that I'm after, my approach is always going to be the same. I use structure as my guide as to where the fish will be, and then I'll pinpoint those fish by fishing the breaks and the break lines on or connected to the structure, both casting or trolling, making sure to check all depths and all speeds. Now, in order to get this done, when I go fishing, I'm going to have some topwater baits. I'm also going to have some weedless baits. Part of the time, I'm going to be using the jump type lures. but I'm also going to be sure to have a whole bunch of spoon plugs. Because if you analyze the importance of these different types of lures over the course of an entire fishing season, the topwater baits and the weedless baits will only be effective about 1% of the time. And then the jump type lures, I'll use them about 8% of the time. But in 90% of my fishing, whether I'm casting or trolling, I'm going to be using spoon plugs, simply because it's the only lure that will allow me to control most all of my depths and all of my speeds. And that's what it takes to consistently catch fish. When Buck Perry first created the spoon plug, he found out that one lure wouldn't do all jobs. So using the same design, he created a series of 7 lures that together would allow him to control all depths and all speeds from 0 to 60 feet, both casting and trolling. Now let's first take a look at trolling. When trolling with spoon plugs, each lure has a minimum and maximum depth range that can be achieved by varying your line lengths. Now, in order to reach a desired depth, we need to monitor the amount of line that is being used. We do this by counting layers as the lure is being dropped out. When the line guide goes from one side of the reel to the other, that is counted as 1 layer. As it returns back, that would be counted as 2 layers. So by counting layers, we'll be able to control exact depths while trolling. Now, using layers as our guide, let me give you the following hand rule for choosing the proper amount of line with each and every spoon plug. The first 3 sizes of lures are meant to be worked in the shallows and should be run on a short line. Now, I consider a short line to be 8 to 10 layers. The next 2 lures were designed to be worked in the medium depths and should be run on a medium line, and this would be 14 to 16 layers. Then the last 2 larger lures that are used in the deeper sections should be run on a long line, which is 18 to 22 layers. Once we've reached 25 feet with the deepest lure and we need to fish deeper, we simply switch to wire line, and then by using the same line lengths, we can effectively double the maximum running depth of each lure. When working with wire, there's a greater variance in the minimum and maximum depth that each lure can be fished, and by running an extra long line, which would be 24 to 28 layers, we can take the largest lure all the way to 60 feet. So by using just one series of lures and 2 different types of line, you now have a system that will allow you to troll each and every depth from the bank to 60 feet. Now, anytime you are wondering whether or not you have the right amount of line out, simply ask yourself, is my lure on the bottom? Now, the hand rules that I've given you should put you somewhere in the ballpark, and then the lure will give you the final answer. If you're not bumping the bottom, you simply need to add a few more layers of line. Now, when we talk about trolling, we have to have a proper trolling rod. I think today, many fishermen today who are trolling are using rods that are far too long. And I suggest that the proper trolling rod should be no more than 4.5 or 4'8". The rod should also be very strong and tough, have a lot of backbone coming out into this area, but then as you get to the end of your rod, into the tip area, you should have some flex so that you'll have good feel and good contact with the lure. And these shorter rods will allow you to fish all day and not tire out. Plus, it'll allow you to have good control over your lure rather than using the longer rod. So in order to go about your fishing properly, we say you have to troll and cast. But unfortunately, a good casting rod does not make a good trolling rod, so you really need to have 2 types. And then as far as the reel is concerned, I happen to use a Penn 109 MF. That stands for a freshwater seat. Now these reels have an anti-reverse, a good brake, has a star drag, is basically built for trolling. It's a service type reel, and it is not free spool. In other words, when I take that brake off and let line out, the reel handle turns backwards. And this is what is desired in a trolling reel, mainly because the free spool reels that are used for casting have a tendency to throw your line out a little bit too quickly. And what happens, you end up getting backlashes, you get messes, and of course that's not what's desired. So A good service reel like this Penn 109 is a great little trolling reel, and that is in fact what I use in my fishing. Now let's talk about the trolling line. Again, the trolling line cannot be the same as the casting line. Good casting line has stretch in it, and it's not really what I suggest you use for trolling. Of course, in order to be able to cast the lure, you have to have stretch in the line. But in trolling, of course, we don't have to cast, so there's no need to have a stretchy line. So Buck has got together with DuPont, and they made a non-stretch monofilament line, which is referred to as no-bow. And this line literally has no stretch in it and makes a great trolling line, and that's what I use for my conventional trolling procedures when using the spoon plug. Now, when using wireline, I use the exact same type of rod, 4.5 feet, and exact same type of reel. But the difference here is that, of course, I'm using wireline, and the way I like to rig this is I like to use about 100 to 110 yards of monofilament backing to back the spool because the wire takes up very little space on the reel itself. And it's ideal if we would have the reel to be filled at all times because the smaller that spool is, the harder it is, the more revolutions you have to turn to pick line up, and it's just harder to work with. So we like to have a pretty full spool regardless whether we're working with no-bow or with the wire line. So in the case of the wire, be sure to use a good backing, probably around 100 yards of backing, and then go ahead and add your wire to it, and then everything else will remain the same. As you can see, once the wire is put on properly, it spools very nicely. It's really no different than working with monofilament line. But it is important that you back the reel because the wire takes up very little space on the reel itself. Now, when using wire line, we have to attach a leader because you can't just put a lure on the end of the wire. It doesn't work very well. So what I do is use a no-bow line, my regular trolling line, for a leader, and I usually make that leader about 4 foot long. And to the end of that leader, I will attach one of my snaps, just like that I use in the rest of my fishing. And the way I attach this leader to my wire is through a number 10 barrel swivel. And I'll just tie a regular clinch knot or an improved clinch. Any knot that you use is fine with me. Now, when I attach the wire to the other end of this swivel, I can't tie a knot because wire will kink, and then of course you'll break off. And so anytime I make any kind of an attachment to my wire line, I'll do it by twisting it on, and I simply run it through the swivel, and then I'll twist it about 18 times, and then that'll be secure and it'll never come loose. Now, a lot of the guys have asked me what type of casting rod that I use when I'm throwing spoon plugs. And I like to use a 7-foot rod, certainly at least 6 foot, but somewhere between 6 and 7 foot long for starters. And then the rod needs to have a certain flex to it. Let me just go ahead and flex this rod and show you what I consider to be an ideal casting rod for throwing the crankbaits, for throwing the spoon plugs. It should look something like that, relatively strong and tough with enough tip to allow you feel and allow you to work that lure properly on the bottom. Now, I don't particularly care what brand name it is. That's up to you. There are a lot of different good rods that are made today. But I sort of like the 96% graphite rods. They seem to work real well. And as I said, I like to have them in a at least 6 foot length. And my personal rod, the one that I'm using here today, is actually 7 foot long. Because most of the time when we're making these casts to the deep structure, we're not so much concerned about pinpoint accuracy, but rather we're concerned about being able to throw the lure far enough. And of course, the longer your rod, the further you can throw a bait. So I like to use a good long 7 foot rod for throwing a spoon plug. And if you're going into a store to look for a good rod, keep this in mind. Most of the manufacturers today will designate as medium heavy the type of rod that I prefer. Now each rod is going to be a little bit different, and some I like better than others, but the medium heavy rods seem to do the best job. Now when casting spoon plugs, it's not necessary to use all of the different sizes. I sometimes use the third size lure when casting the shallows, but the spoon plug was really designed for fishing the deeper waters. When casting deep structure, there are a few simple rules that should be followed. In the first place, it's much easier to control your depth and speed by fishing uphill, so you should always anchor your boat in the shallower areas and cast into the deep water. This anchoring position should always be in 10 feet of water or less, so that your angle of retrieve is not too steep. The two medium-sized lures are the ones that are used for this work, and after you make your cast, you simply allow the lure to sink all the way to the bottom. And during the retrieve, the design of the lure will keep it on the bottom all the way back to the boat, and no other lure will do this. So in summation, you can see by using two different types of rods, two different types of line, and just one series of lures, it's now possible to fish exact depths, both casting and trolling from the bank all the way to 60 feet. Now there are countless lure makers in our industry that claim to have the greatest lure that has ever been built. But as my daddy used to say, talk is cheap. And when all is said and done, the proof is in the live well.